Apartheid South Africa did not begin as a single political decision, but as a long process shaped by colonial expansion, land seizure, labor systems, and racial classification that evolved over more than 3 centuries. To understand this, we have to go way back. Like, way, way back. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a supply station at the Cape of Good Hope, present-day Cape Town, to support trade routes between Europe and Asia. Although the settlement was initially small and practical in purpose, it was established in a region already inhabited by the Khoi pastoralists and San hunter-gatherer communities, who had lived there for thousands of years. Early interactions quickly became unequal as Dutch settlers expanded farmland, restricted indigenous grazing land, and introduced European-style private property systems that did not exist in the same form locally. As the colony grew, conflict intensified. The Dutch imported enslaved people from other parts of Africa, Madagascar, India, and Southeast Asia, creating a deeply layered society where race, labor, and legal status became increasingly connected. Over time, a settler population known as Boers or Afrikaners developed a distinct identity. Many moved beyond the original Cape settlement as semi-independent frontier farmers called trekboers, expanding deeper into the interior. This expansion was not centrally planned, but its effects were consistent. Indigenous communities were displaced, absorbed into labor systems, or pushed into marginal lands. Frontier conflicts with groups such as the Khoi and Xhosa became recurring and long-lasting, forming a cycle of warfare, retaliation, and territorial loss. By the late 18th century, global European conflicts reshaped control of the region. In 1795, Britain took control of the Cape Colony during the Napoleonic Wars to prevent French influence from spreading along critical trade routes. After a brief return to Dutch administration, Britain permanently occupied the Cape in 1806. British rule introduced new legal structures and economic policies, including reforms that increasingly clashed with Boer agricultural interests. One of the most significant turning points came in 1833 when Britain abolished slavery across its empire. At the Cape, this disrupted the economic foundation of many Boer farms, where enslaved labor had been central to production. Although compensation was offered, many settlers felt it was inadequate and chose to leave British-controlled territory. This dissatisfaction contributed to the Great Trek during the 1830s and 1840s, when thousands of Boers migrated into the interior of southern Africa. They formed independent republics, including the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, Transvaal. These states were built on the principle of racial exclusion, reserving land ownership, political participation, and legal rights for white settlers, while excluding the black African majority populations living in those territories. At the same time, the region remained socially complex, with emerging mixed communities such as the Griqua forming their own identities and small political structures in frontier zones. Throughout the 19th century, British imperial expansion continued alongside Boer state formation. Britain gradually extended its influence through diplomacy and warfare, including major conflicts with African states such as the Xhosa in a series of frontier wars and with the Zulu Kingdom in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. The defeat of the Zulu Kingdom marked the collapse of one of the most powerful indigenous political and military systems in the region. Later, tensions between Britain and the Boer republics escalated into the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902. This war was extremely destructive, involving guerrilla resistance from Boer fighters and scorched earth tactics from British forces. Entire rural areas were destroyed, farms burned, livestock confiscated, and civilians placed in concentration camps where tens of thousands died from disease and starvation. The war ended with British victory and full control over the region. In 1910, Britain unified its South African territories into the Union of South Africa. This new political entity was a self-governing dominion within the British Empire, but was structured almost entirely around white minority rule. The Union combined 4 former colonies: Cape Colony, Natal, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. From the beginning, black South Africans were excluded from national political power, and governance was placed in the hands of a white minority that represented a small fraction of the population. Early legislation, including land restriction policies such as the Natives Land Act of 1913, began formalizing territorial segregation by limiting black land ownership to small designated reserves, laying the foundation for future apartheid geography. As the 20th century progressed, racial classification became more systematic. South African law divided people into 4 official categories: white, black, African, Indian, and colored. These categories were not merely descriptive, but legal definitions that determined where individuals could live, work, study, and even who they could marry. The colored category, in particular, was fluid and inconsistently applied, often based on appearance, ancestry, language, and administrative judgment. Government classification boards had authority to reassign racial identity, meaning individuals could be reclassified over time. This sometimes split families into different racial categories, forcing them into separate residential areas and legal systems. Identity became something controlled by the state rather than self-defined. At the same time, South Africa's economy was transformed by mineral discoveries. Diamonds found in Kimberley in 1867 and gold discovered in the Witwatersrand in 1886 turned the region into a global mining hub. This wealth required massive labor supplies, leading to the creation of migrant labor systems that pulled black men from rural areas into mines under harsh conditions. Workers often lived in tightly controlled compounds, separated from families, and were subjected to dangerous work environments with low wages. This system deeply disrupted rural economies and entrenched racialized labor dependency within the South African economy. After World War II, industrial growth accelerated and urbanization increased rapidly. Black South Africans moved into cities in large numbers to work in factories, construction, and services. White political leaders viewed this demographic shift as a threat to political control and social order. In 1948, the National Party came to power under Daniel Francois Malan and formally introduced apartheid as official state policy. Apartheid was not simply segregation. It was an integrated legal system designed to permanently structure society along racial lines and maintain white minority dominance. Under apartheid, the Population Registration Act required every person to be classified by race at birth. The Group Areas Act enforced residential segregation by assigning racial groups to specific geographic zones. The pass laws required black South Africans to carry identification documents to enter white designated urban areas. Failure to produce pass documents could result in arrest, imprisonment, or forced relocation. The Bantu Education Act created a separate education system designed specifically for black South Africans, intentionally limiting academic advancement and reinforcing labor roles. Public facilities, transportation systems, hospitals, beaches, and parks were all segregated. Interracial relationships were criminalized under strict morality laws. The system was enforced through a powerful police state supported by surveillance, arrests, and detention without trial. Resistance developed gradually and then intensified. By 1955, multiple anti-apartheid organizations gathered in Kliptown to form the Freedom Charter, a document declaring that South Africa belonged to all who lived in it regardless of race. It called for democratic governance, equal rights, fair redistribution of land, and equal access to education and employment. The African National Congress, South African Indian Congress, colored organizations, and allied activists contributed to its creation. The government responded by arresting leaders and initiating the treason trial, detaining hundreds of activists for years without final convictions, aiming to dismantle organized resistance through legal pressure. As repression intensified, apartheid policies became more radical. Forced removals expanded, displacing entire communities from areas designated for whites and relocating them into overcrowded townships. One of the most significant structural policies was the creation of Bantustans under the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959. These territories were designated for different ethnic groups, including Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, and Ciskei. The government declared them self-governing and later independent, but no international government recognized them. Millions of black South Africans were forcibly relocated into these regions, losing South African citizenship and political rights. This system fragmented opposition and attempted to justify exclusion by presenting it as ethnic self-determination. In the 1960s, resistance shifted significantly after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where police opened fire on peaceful protesters opposing pass laws, killing 69 people and injuring many more. The event shocked the country and the world. In response, the government banned political organizations such as the African National Congress and Pan-Africanist Congress. In turn, the ANC formed an armed wing called Umkhonto we Sizwe, led by figures including Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Joe Slovo. The organization began a sabotage campaign targeting infrastructure such as power stations, government buildings, and transport systems, aiming to avoid civilian casualties while disrupting state operations. The state responded with mass arrests and expanded security laws. Mandela was arrested in 1962 and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964, becoming a central global symbol of resistance. Despite repression, resistance continued internally and externally. Underground networks operated within townships, while exile movements built international alliances. Neighboring countries such as Mozambique, Angola, Zambia, and Tanzania became bases for liberation movements. During the Cold War, apartheid South Africa aligned with Western anti-communist powers, while liberation groups received support from socialist states, turning the conflict into part of a broader global ideological struggle. By the 1970s, resistance intensified further. One of the most important turning points came in 1976, with the Soweto Uprising, which began as a protest by students against the enforcement of Afrikaans as a compulsory language of instruction in black schools. Students saw Afrikaans as the language of oppression and demanded to be taught in languages they understood. On June 16th, thousands of students marched peacefully through Soweto toward administrative offices. Police blocked their path and used tear gas to disperse them, but the students regrouped and continued marching. Tensions escalated when police opened fire on the crowd, killing and injuring students. One of the first and most widely documented victims was 13-year-old Hector Peterson, whose image being carried through the chaos became an international symbol of apartheid brutality. After the first shootings, protests spread rapidly across Soweto and then to other townships throughout the country. What began as a student demonstration turned into nationwide unrest involving strikes, protests, and riots. Students burned government buildings, schools associated with apartheid education, and infrastructure symbols of state control. The government responded with military deployment, curfews, mass arrests, and armed patrols in townships. The violence continued for months, and estimates suggest hundreds of students were killed in the aftermath, with thousands arrested or detained. Schools became centers of political organization, and a new generation of activists emerged. Many young people fled South Africa to join liberation movements in exile, strengthening the ANC's external operations. Internationally, images from Soweto triggered a major shift in global opinion, leading to increased sanctions, cultural boycotts, and economic divestment campaigns against South Africa. The uprising marked a decisive turning point in which apartheid could no longer be viewed as stable or domestically accepted, but as a system facing sustained internal rebellion and global condemnation. In the late 1970s and 1980s, South Africa also expanded its regional military involvement, particularly in Angola, where it fought against liberation movements and their allies in proxy conflicts tied to the Cold War. Internally, the state increased repression through states of emergency, granting security forces wide powers of detention without trial. Opposition movements such as the United Democratic Front emerged, coordinating internal resistance across communities, churches, unions, and civic organizations. At the same time, South Africa secretly developed nuclear weapons capability, eventually producing a small arsenal of warheads during the 1980s. These weapons were kept classified and were later dismantled during the transition to democracy. By the mid-1980s, apartheid faced escalating internal unrest, economic sanctions, international isolation, and growing instability. The government attempted limited reforms in 1983 through a tricameral parliament, that granted representation to colored and Indian populations, but continued to exclude black Africans entirely. This system was widely rejected as insufficient and symbolic rather than substantive change. By the late 1980s, sustained pressure forced negotiations. Secret talks began between the government and imprisoned or exiled ANC leaders. In 1990, President F.W. de Klerk announced the unbanning of liberation movements and released Nelson Mandela after 27 years in prison. Over the following years, negotiations continued amid political violence and uncertainty, but both sides moved toward a transitional agreement. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections under universal suffrage. The African National Congress won a majority, and Nelson Mandela became the country's first black president. Apartheid laws were dismantled and replaced with a new constitution guaranteeing equal rights. However, economic inequality, spatial segregation, and unequal access to opportunity remained deeply embedded due to the long legacy of colonialism and apartheid.